Hey guys, it's the Comics Kid 2099. I hope you guys had a great holiday season. I am back with another topic video. I just wanted to talk a little bit today about the Incredible Hulk and what I perceive to be a lack of status quo in this series. You compare the Hulk to, let's say, Daredevil. Daredevil, of course, when he started off in the 1960s, he was created by Stan Lee. And, oh wow, this is embarrassing. I don't remember the artist who co-created Daredevil. But he was very different from what we think of Daredevil today. It wasn't really until the late 70s, early 80s when Frank Miller turned Daredevil into the kind of character that we think of now. Very dark, very brooding, and more grittier all around. Even when writers are doing something a little different with Daredevil. For example, Mark Waid, he's not really doing the dark, grim, and gritty Daredevil. Even so, his Daredevil still feels very consistent with what's gone before. It may be a lighter tone, but it still feels very much like the same kind of Daredevil. It doesn't feel like it's doing a complete 180 and going in an entirely different direction than what's gone before. This still feels a whole lot like the same kind of premise that Brian Michael Bendis or Ed Brubaker or Frank Miller has worked with on this character. It doesn't feel like this character is going through an entirely different status quo every time you have a creator on the book. And that's really what I wanted to talk about with the Hulk. The Hulk started off in the early 60s, I think 1962, as basically an ongoing werewolf series. You had Bruce Banner, and at night he would become the Hulk, who is this gray and eventually green lumbering monster. He would fight aliens, he would fight monsters, he would fight communists. It was basically just kind of what you would expect in that transitional period that was going from the horror comics of the 1950s to the superhero comics of the 1960s. And the status quo was basically a broken status quo from the very beginning, because you have Bruce Banner who wants to get rid of the Hulk, and then he is in love with Betty Ross, and then her father is hunting them down. And there's virtually no part of this that works as an ongoing status quo that in theory is going to help you produce more stories. If Bruce Banner cures himself of the Hulk, you've ended the series. If General Ross captures the Hulk, you've ended the series. I've heard this called Gilligan's Island syndrome before, where basically your entire premise relies on how long you can keep up something that is pretty shaky to start with. And in this case, it's something where your characters, they have a quest, they have a goal, and you know you can never let them achieve that, because once you do, your story is over. And I'm not saying that the lack of premise or the lack of a good premise had anything to do with this, but I think it's very telling that the Hulk series actually only lasted 6 issues and then it was canceled. And then for about a year and a half, Hulk was just jumping around being a guest star in various comics. He was in the Fantastic Four a couple of times. He guest starred in a few other books before finally replacing Giant Man as half of the feature in Tales to Astonish. During this time, where the Hulk is just jumping around from book to book being a guest star, I think it's very indicative that he didn't have a status quo. The writers didn't know what to do with him, so they just kept this character who apparently was very interesting to them, otherwise they wouldn't have bothered putting him as a guest star, and all they did was just use him in other titles until they could think of something to do with him, like making him be a founding member of the Avengers for about 2 issues before getting rid of him. It wasn't until the late 1970s when the Incredible Hulk television series basically gave us the Hulk status quo that almost everyone is familiar with. The idea that David Banner, or Bruce Banner in the comics, is on the run from the government, and he's trying to cure himself of the Hulk, and then hilarity ensues, basically. This, of course, part of this had been going on since the Hulk was created in the 1960s, but I think this series really is what familiarized everybody with this status quo. And yet, this status quo isn't around nearly as much as you would think. In the 1980s, John Byrne, he had a very short run on the Hulk where he separated Hulk from Bruce Banner. And this was really more of just a standalone story arc. It was about 5 issues long in the actual series, and then he did an annual and an issue of Marvel Fanfare. This run would have lasted a lot longer, but according to John Byrne, Jim Shooter had approved of all of these ideas that John Byrne had, and then once Byrne came onto the book, Jim Shooter, who was the editor-in-chief at the time, he no longer approved of these ideas, and he basically said, no, you can't do this. So Byrne left after one story arc. I think it's very interesting that here, it's very clear that we're not really dealing with a status quo, we're dealing with a very hot creator in the form of John Byrne. He comes on a title, and the very first thing he does is redefine the book with a brand new angle. And I don't know if this had been going on a whole lot before John Byrne, because basically this is the earliest run of the Hulk that I have read. This is an ongoing, recurring thing that continues to happen on up until today that I'm going to talk about a little bit. With Byrne's run, it really does feel more like an espionage sort of book, almost like very James Bondish with loud superhero action. And then in the 1990s, for about 12 years, Peter David was on the title. And I haven't read that run because it hasn't all been collected in trades. So I really can't say anything about what Peter David did on the book, although I do know that he did a lot of work with the Grey Hulk. He did a lot of different things with this character. And then in the early 2000s, Bruce Jones started on the Hulk, and this was actually my first encounter with the character in the comics. And Bruce Jones was on the book for about 40 or 50 issues, and his run was very much a espionage type storyline that was ongoing throughout his whole run, even more so than John Byrne's. Where John Byrne's run was very colorful and superheroic, this felt very much like a cross between the X-Files and Mission Impossible. It was very shadowy. You had characters hiding in the background and they were manipulate events, and a lot of this even has gone on to kind of influence the Hulk in the movies. There's, in The Incredible Hulk, Mr. Green and Mr. Blue talking to each other online. That is straight out of Bruce Jones's run. But this, in a way, was the first time, as far as I can understand, the first time in a long time where the Hulk had gone back to the typical status quo that everyone associates with the Hulk, where he's on the run from the government and he encounters these problems and he helps solve them as the Hulk or as Bruce Banner, and in a lot of ways that was pretty much the status quo of the television series. And then after Bruce Jones's run, you had Greg Pak on the Hulk for Planet Hulk and then World War Hulk. And Planet Hulk was basically 12 to 14 issues of Hulk in space as Conan the Barbarian. And this was one of my earliest run-ins with the Hulk. I had already been pretty familiar with the Hulk from Bruce Jones's run, but this was one of the first Hulk graphic novels that I got, I think. And it was very much a standalone. You could come into this without knowing anything about the Hulk, really. And in a lot of ways, a lot of these different runs from these hot creators, they're like that. You can come into Mark Waid's Indestructible Hulk, you can come into Jason Aaron's Hulk, you can come into Peter David's Hulk without really knowing anything about the character, because all of these different warring status quos, they don't really jive together. You don't need to know about Hulk as an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., just for an example. I don't think that ever actually happened. You don't need to know about Hulk, agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. when you're reading Hulk, Conan in Space. And then after Greg Pak left the title, you had Jeff Loeb on the title, and I think there were 2 or 3 Hulk books going on at once. And I didn't really read any of these because the Red Hulk, Blue Hulk, 1 Hulk, 2 Hulk, all of that looked really silly to me, and I just skipped it altogether. But really, I couldn't tell if there was any evidence of a status quo existing at all, other than a whole bunch of Hulks fighting other characters. It might be Hulk fighting another Hulk, it might be Hulk fighting Watcher, it might be Hulk fighting Thor, but really it was just Hulks fighting people. And I mean, I guess that's a status quo, but it's not much of one. I would take the 1960s flawed status quo over Hulk smashes, which is, I mean, smashing is fine, but you know, if that's all of your status quo, then you definitely need to go back for a redraft, I would say. And then after Jeff Loeb's somewhat extensive run on the Hulk titles, you had Jason Aaron's run, which I briefly mentioned. And this was, again, another example of you have a very hot creator come on to a title, and he changes everything up and goes in a completely new direction. In this case, from what I understand, Bruce Banner was treated as a mad scientist and kind of sort of the villain of the piece, and then the Hulk was kind of sort of the protagonist. This was something that, from what I understand, has never been done with the Hulk before. And it would have been a very interesting way to handle the Hulk, except that Jason Aaron only was on this book for about a year. And then following him, you had Mark Waid, another hot creator who has a brand new take on the Hulk. In this case, Banner is working with S.H.I.E.L.D., and the Hulk is kind of sort of his force for good. Where the Hulk has always kind of been a force of destruction, Banner is finally, according to Mark Waid in an interview I read, he is trying to channel the Hulk as a force for good. And Waid's motto with this series is, Hulk smashes, Banner builds. And again, this is something that really intrigues me. What I've noticed in all of these very differing status quos, or lack of a status quo overall, is I'm interested in all of them. Jason Aaron's run, where Bruce Banner is the villain and Hulk is the protagonist, and Mark Waid's run, where it seems like Banner is the protagonist and Hulk is just a force of nature, these two runs sound like they could not be more different, but I'm very interested in reading both of them. But going back to comparing this to Daredevil, even though you might have different runs on Daredevil, Bendis' run is different than Brubaker's run, which is different than Waid's run, which is different than some other run, you still have, Daredevil feels like he's the same character. You feel like you're not getting a different status quo every time a new creator comes on that title. And I think that's the big thing that really kind of surprised me today. It came as an epiphany when I was reading Byrne's run on the Hulk, is that he does not have a consistent status quo. You have the series The X-Men, their status quo is pretty fluid, but even them, for the last 30 to 40 years, it's basically been the same thing. Just the last 2 years, it's really kind of been shaken up, but I don't see that lasting a very long time. Not like the way the Hulk has with every brand new creator that's on this book, you get a brand new status quo. And earlier, when I was thinking of what I wanted to say in this video, I was thinking that I really didn't like this. I was really saying, you know, I wish that you could have someone like Jason Aaron and he could stay on this title for a long time, and that finally you could have a status quo that takes some traction and finally sticks, unlike every other status quo of this series. I mean, you look at Peter David, he was on this title for 12 years, and his status quo didn't stick. As soon as he was gone, the next writer just went in a completely new direction. And sometimes that's necessary. You look at Captain America right now, Ed Brubaker just got off of that title for 8 years, and Rick Remender is following him up. So naturally, Rick Remender is doing something completely different. Because if you're going to follow up the guy who made everybody like Captain America, you don't want to try and do anything similar to what he did. And I'm sure it's the same way on the Hulk. You don't want to do something even a little bit similar to Peter David, because then you're going to be compared to Peter David. But earlier I was saying I really wish that you could have one status quo that really just nails it and everyone likes it, and then that can be the status quo with the Hulk. But now, after kind of reading through this and kind of coming to my thoughts, I think I've really decided that I much prefer Hulk having just all of these very different status quos. and the next guy who does Hulk, maybe Hulk is going to be an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. Maybe Hulk is going to be a time traveler. Maybe he's going to go back in space. Or maybe he's going to go back to being a fugitive who's on the run. You don't know. But I really am enjoying how with each new creator, you're basically getting a brand new title with a brand new premise, brand new status quo, brand new supporting characters, and I love that. I'm curious to see what you guys have to think, and if you can think of any other characters who are like this. I really don't think I can think of any who are like this with the Hulk. So anyway, I am the Comics Kid 2099, and this has been me talking about the Hulk. I'll see you guys next time.